So we're joined today by Suzanne Winter at the inquiry, a former post office investigator who led a case in Belfast in Northern Ireland against a sub-postmaster, Mr. McLaughlin, accusing him of stealing over £11,000. But despite evidence being produced to the contrary to show that she was the lead investigator on the case, which she admits, she seems to be unhappy to change her previous statement that it wasn't a Horizon case, even though it's clearly alleged by his solicitors, well, by him through his solicitors, that that is indeed what it is. Let's jump straight into the inquiry.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear us?
I can, thank you.
Ms. Winter, moving please to Mr. McLaughlin's defence statement. Could we have that on screen, please? The reference is AMCL 5035. The first page here is a covering letter from Mr. McLaughlin's solicitors dated the 19th of April 2004. And going to page 3 of this document, please, we have the defence statement itself. We see we can go back to that first page, please. We see the background set out. Scrolling down slowly, please. And then
So this relates to a case. So we're going to hear from another post office investigator today, or former post office investigator. So the background's this: the defendant faced 15 allegations of false accounting contrary to section 17(1)(a) of the Theft Act, Northern Ireland 1969. The offences are alleged to have occurred on various dates between the 30th of December 2000, so not long after the Horizon rollout, and 26th of July 2001 in the County Court Division of Belfast. We're talking about a very short period of time. At the time, the defendant was working in his capacity as a sub-postmaster at the Brookfield Post Office, Tennant Street in Belfast.
Section on admissions denials, and at the bottom of the first page we have this.
So let's have a look at it. So the defendant accepts that during the relevant time he was working in his capacity as a sub-postmaster at the Brookfield office, Tennant Street, Belfast. The defendant was a self-employed individual operating under a franchise agreement, so pretty standard for all the non-Crown post offices at the time. Consignia, remember that when they had a bit of a rebrand to Consignia and later abandoned it, from July 1999 until July 2001. I think it was Royal Mail that went through the Consignia branding, wasn't it? Oh no, it wasn't Royal Mail, it was the post office that went through the Consignia branding, I was right. From which the premises was operated was subject to a 5-year lease held by the defendant. The defendant did not work at the premises after July 2001, however he allowed the premises to be used for the purpose of running the post office until the business ceased trading in February 2002, presumably because of these allegations. It is understood that the post office business was deemed no longer financially viable by February 2002. Wonder whether that was by the sub-postmaster or the post office themselves. It is also understood that significant and unexplained losses were still servicing the business after July 2001, when the defendant ceased having any direct role in it. Well, that does suggest that you've got the wrong person, usually, even if it was happening, or that the system wasn't working if it wasn't happening.
It is understood that the post office business was deemed no longer financially viable by February 2002. It is also understood that significant and unexplained losses were still surfacing in the business after July 2001, when the defendant ceased having any direct role in it. So Mr. McLaughlin was placing unexplained losses in his defence statement, wasn't he, by this paragraph?
This was the post office after he had left as a postmaster.
Yes, we'll come on to what he says happened in relation to before, but the reference there to the unexplained losses was still surfacing in the business. That's on that very first page. And then going, please, over the page.
So let's have a look here on the admissions. The defendant accepts that he amended and altered certain documents as detailed in his interviews. The full extent of the defendant's case is set out in his interviews, the particulars of which can be referred to. So it should be in conjunction with this. However, the defendant denies that he amended or altered the said documents dishonestly, or that he was motivated by dishonesty. So he's saying he wasn't lying, saying he's made a mistake. He further denies that he was acting, whether as alleged or at all, with a view to gain by himself or another. So he wasn't seeking to enrich himself, according to his statement. Specifically, the defendant denies that he intended to cause loss to another, or that such a loss was caused to another. The defendant would say that his only interaction was to balance the accounts in the business, and that his actions were carried out by no improper motive. The defendant denies that he caused the loss to the post office of the value of £10,288.47. He would say that the charges in the indictment do not reflect the value, and this figure has been arrived at by taking all of the input errors for the given period and attributing them to the defendant. The defendant would say that a large number of these identified transactions have not been carried out by him. Further, these transaction errors may have been rectified at a later stage, so that would be presumably that would be approved by the ARQ data, which I am sure they've requested in this case. The defendant would say that the conduct alleged by the Crown, the totality of which is not accepted in any event, does not make out 15 charges of false accounting. So essentially he's saying, I didn't do it, but even if we take your evidence, or the post office's evidence at face value, it doesn't even make out 15 charges of false accounting, contrary to Section 17(1)A of the Theft Act Northern Ireland 1969.
The defendant's case is set out, so the defendant accepts that he amended and altered certain documents as detailed in his interviews. The full extent of the defendant's case is set out in his interviews, the particulars of which can be referred to. However, the defendant denies that he amended and altered the said documents dishonestly or that he was motivated by dishonesty. He further denies that he was acting, whether as alleged or at all, with a view to gain by himself or another. Specifically, the defendant denies that he intended to cause loss to another or that such loss was caused to another. The defendant would say that his only intention was to balance the accounts in the business and that his actions were actuated by no improper motive. The defendant denies that he caused a loss to the post office to the value of £10,288.47. He would say that the charges in the indictment do not reflect this value, and this figure has been arrived at by taking all of the input errors for the given period and attributing them to the defendant. The defendant would say that a large number of these identified transactions have not been carried out by him. Further, these transaction errors may have been rectified at a later stage. The defendant would say that the conduct alleged by the Crown, the totality of which is not accepted in any event, does not make out the 15 charges of false accounting.
So, points taken issue with. So, the things he doesn't agree with. The defendant takes issue with the evidence of the prosecution witnesses in this case, insofar, presumably one of them being the investigator here at the inquiry, as they tend to suggest, imply, or infer that the defendant engaged in false accounting contrary to Section 17(1)A of the Theft Act Northern Ireland 1969, whether as alleged or at all, save unless stated otherwise in this statement. In particular, he denies, the denies that, I'm sure that's supposed to be he. Yeah, he denies that he amended and or altered the said documents dishonestly, or that he was motivated by dishonesty with a view to gain by himself or another, intending to cause loss to another, or such a loss was caused to another. So basically saying there was no foul motive here, and he wasn't either seeking to enrich himself or deny others money that they were entitled to, i.e. the post office. The defendant would take issue with any Crown evidence that would tend to suggest, imply, or infer that his intention was not to balance the accounts in the business and or that his actions were actuated by an improper motive. The defendant only accepts such alteration or amendment of documentation as is disclosed in his interviews, and only in the manner and extent which is detailed in his interviews. So essentially what he's saying is, I've already told you the truth about this, as you can see in my interviews, and I stand by it. So he's not changing his story or his account of what's happened.
And then we have points taken issue with. And before we turn to that, it's clear here in his case that he denies dishonesty and puts in issue, doesn't he, whether there was an actual loss to the post office. Would you agree with what we've just been through?
What he said there, yes.
Yeah. And then we have points taken issue with, and the penultimate paragraph on that page, the defendant would take issue with any Crown evidence that would tend to suggest, imply, or infer that his intention was not to balance the accounts in the business and or that his actions were actuated by an improper motive. The defendant only accepts such alteration or amendment of the documentation as is disclosed in his interviews, and only to the manner and extent that this is detailed in his interviews. Going over the page, please.
Right, so further points to take issue with. The defendant takes issue with any assertion that he caused a loss to the post office to the value of £10,288.47 as particularised above, i.e. saying it didn't happen. The defendant would also say that he had experienced difficulties in balancing the accounts from time from the time he took over the franchise. So he's saying from the very beginning he's had problems, basically, with Horizon not coming out with shortfalls. He believes that this may have been largely the fault of the accounting system and or the equipment he was obliged to use. The system rarely, if ever, balanced and was always prone to error. Well, it's a bit of a damning verdict on the Horizon system, isn't it? The defendant would say that the post office, consignia, was aware of account balancing problems and errors in the system that the defendant was experiencing. Well, we now know that to be the case, don't we? The post office sent in people to try to help the defendant with problems that he was experiencing, but the problems were never remedied and the source of the problems was never discovered. Sounds like they were having a real problem putting the finger on it, or they weren't putting in the effort to put the finger on what was the cause of the problem. At least not then. Furthermore, the defendant takes issue with the manner in which he was interviewed. The defendant requires any further material to be disclosed that assists with his defence as now disclosed. Any material that undermines the credibility or reliability of the witnesses in this case or the allegations made should be disclosed forthwith. In particular, and without prejudice to the generality of the foregoing, the defendant requires to be disclosed any and all information. Basically, what they're saying is, if you're trying to make me out to be a liar, show your hand now. I want to see the evidence. Because if you don't know what the evidence is, it's hard to refute it and mount a defence against it. So it seems very fair to want to have that.
The defendant takes issue with any assertion that he caused a loss to the post office to that value as particularised above. The defendant would say that he had experienced difficulties in balancing the accounts from the time that he took over the franchise. He believes that this may have been largely the fault of the accounting system and or equipment that he was obliged to use. The system rarely, if ever, balanced and was always prone to error. The defendant would say that the post office, brackets consignia, was aware of account balancing problems and errors in the system that the defendant was experiencing. The post office sent in people to try to help the defendant with the problems that he was experiencing, but the problems were never remedied and the source of the problems was never discovered. So Mr. McLaughlin was clearly setting out here, wasn't he, that he had experienced balancing faults from the outset after he took over the Brookfield post office, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
And he stated in clear terms that he believed the difficulties were caused by the accounting system or the equipment he was required to use, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
He explained that the system rarely balanced and was prone to error, and he also goes on to say that consignia and the post office were aware of his account balancing problems and the errors on the system. Could we have on screen, please, page 20 of Miss Winter's statement? It's page 20, the top of that page, please. This is a continuation of paragraph 34 from the page before. And you say, one line down, I do recall sometimes when SPMs would cite Horizon as the issue, but cannot recall the offices or the issues. I do not recall any of these being prosecuted with me as the investigating officer. Having looked through both the interview and the defence statement in Mr. McLaughlin's case, do you accept that your recollection set out here is wrong? You were the lead investigator in Mr. McLaughlin's case. He cited Horizon as the issue and he was prosecuted.
No, I don't believe it was wrong.
You can't be the prosecutor in a case, or the lead investigator for the post office in a case, and produce a witness statement that says, I don't actually recall any of these things being an issue. I don't recall any specific offices or bugs or issues with the system. She did say above that she thought the Horizon system was reliable. And now she's being presented with Mr. McLaughlin's witness statement saying, actually, I am a person that you've prosecuted, that you've launched a private prosecution against, and how can she not now take back that recollection? I mean, this would be the perfect point to correct it when you're faced with evidence to the contrary. Let's listen.
In what respect do you say it is not wrong? You're saying here that there were cases where SPMs would cite Horizon as the issue.
I think, were you asking me that Mr. McLaughlin was citing this as a Horizon issue? Is that right?
I'm asking you whether you think this recollection in your statement is correct still, having been through the defence statement in Mr. McLaughlin's case. His defence was Horizon issues. You were the lead investigator in his case and he was prosecuted. So it would appear that this is wrong, this recollection in your statement here. Is that right?
No, because Mr. McLaughlin's case, I would not have cited it as a horizon case, and neither did the police believe that or the crime prosecution.
But he did. You can't ignore the fact that he's citing that problem. I mean, everybody's entitled to mount a defence against a prosecution against him. You can't actually, you can't say, oh no, it's not a horizon case. It's not just whether you think it's a horizon case, it's whether the suspect in a case has actually said or raised that as a possible defence to the allegations.
Okay, Mr. McLaughlin cited that, though, didn't he, in his defence statement in terms that we've just looked at?
Yes, Mr. McLaughlin has cited it.
Okay.